So what is it about questions? Do we ask questions at all? And why are we so quick to give answers but slow to ask questions? Is it that we don't know how? Or that we know how but don't find them all that important? Why are we so confident in our answers yet insecure in our questions? What's the difference between a good question and a great one? And what is it about the power of a great question? Why is it that questions provide things that answers simply cannot? And why do some questions grip us and others won't let go? Why those questions? What would it look like? What would it take for you to be accused of being someone who asked great questions? Did you ever consider why Jesus asked so many great questions? And what does it say about a leader, a pastor, a follower of Jesus who doesn't ask very many questions? In this new reality that we find ourselves in, what if faithfully following Jesus wasn't primarily about giving all the right answers, but instead was about asking the most significant of questions? And how might the discipline of asking significant, poignant, and courageous questions be a catalyst for gospel conversations in the days ahead? If asking questions was crucial to Jesus's life and ministry, what can we learn from him about how we can open up space to share the good news in order for the presence of God to be at work? You see, for most of us, we have been dramatically impacted by the questions that we have asked and that we have been asked. And the word question, of course, comes from the word quest. And a quest sends you on a journey, often in search of something valuable. Questions send us on a journey and often in search of something valuable. It takes us somewhere deeper. It provides something more meaningful than what lies on the surface. The famous Greek philosopher Socrates, of course, was known for his great questions. Over 400 years before Jesus, he used many different types of questions as a method of developing thoughts and opinions in others that would otherwise not have been drawn out. And he believed that questions were useful in leading to greater understanding. And his method, of course, known around the world for quite some time, is the Socratic method. Now, Socrates used two metaphors to describe questions. The first one, he described questions as a gadfly, a fly that would sting a horse and would cause a great form of irritation. But he also described it as a midwife. Socrates' mother was a midwife. And based on his mother's experience, he found the technique of using questions to bring about learning and exploration similar to the role of a midwife, of bringing new life into the world. I once asked a midwife, what was her primary role in the role of a home birth? And she said this to me. She said, my role is to hold space and tend to the sacred moment for God to bring about new life. Let me say that again. She said, my job is to hold space and tend to the sacred moment for God to bring about new life. That's always stuck with me. Could that not be said of questions in our gospel conversations? Holding space and tending to the sacred moment for God to bring about new life. Could there not be a more important and poignant description of evangelism than that? You see, we often live with the faulty assumption that our role in evangelism is primarily about using our mouths. But let me be clear, using our mouths is a crucial part of evangelism. We proclaim the good news. But in this new reality, which is filled with so much uncertainty, what if our questions were the most fruitful form of evangelism moving forward? In this moment, the world is looking for healers. And oftentimes, how healers bring about the healing is not in the speaking, but in the listening and being with others. When we ask questions, great questions, the focus is not on us, of course, it's on others. And with questions, midwives come alongside of mothers in the birthing process. They provide help and support, they enrich and guide, but it's not about the midwife, it's about the mother and the child. Well, let's consider Jesus and his questions. What did Jesus utilize in order to bring about transformation in people's lives? He took his listeners and his followers on what I call three kinds of field trips. The first one was a physical field trip. He went on trips, quite literally. He looked at he said, look at the birds of the air. Look at the lilies of the field. He went people watching in the temple, and he watched the woman drop in 2 mites, and he seized the teachable moment with his disciples. This is called peripatetic ministry by walking around. Have you ever noticed how much of Jesus's teachings in the Gospels happen outside of Sunday school classrooms and sanctuaries? Jesus knew people learn with their bodies when they are fully engaged in real life. But the second kind of field trip is he took them on emotional or imaginative field trips. He told great stories, of course, his parables, many of whom, even those far from Jesus today, can still tell them, like the story of the Good Samaritan. Stories, of course, grip us, and that's where our hearts are most fully engaged. Even our brains light up more neurologically when stories are told. You sit in a movie theater, not now, but you used to sit in a movie theater with a whole bunch of people, and you were moved into a different world, another time, another place, even though you never left the chair you were sitting in. Your whole experience, you were transformed in a different place because you were taken on an emotional field trip. And Jesus, the third field trip he used, in addition to a physical field trip and then emotional field trip, is he took people on mental or cognitive field trips. And this is where his question asking was so brilliant. Of course, raised in the rabbinical system that asked questions. He himself being a rabbi, he would ask questions. And when someone gives you an answer, you remain passive. But when someone asks you a question, your entire brain lights up neurologically as well. You are now a participant in the conversation, in your interaction in life. And these three field trips that Jesus took his listeners on, physical field trips, emotional field trips, and mental field trips, that what do we do when we try to communicate God and his magnificent story to others? We sit them in a room, we speak propositionally and abstract, and then we give them answers and facts. And then we sit around and wonder why nobody is changed by what we're doing. Instead of doing the opposite of what Jesus did, we should employ the methods of Jesus. But it's this third kind of field trip, the concept of questions, that I want to look at here today. My doctoral work focused on equipping kingdom leaders to grow to ask better questions for greater fruitfulness and gospel transformation. I studied each of the questions Jesus asked, what he asked, where he asked, who he asked the question to, who was present, to whom was the question directed, where else in the Gospels was it asked, and which of the 27 different types of questions did he use when he asked it. Now, Jesus asked questions brilliantly, and the more I study his questions, the more amazed I become, and I continue to be amazed. Asking questions was central to Jesus's life and teachings. And so what questions did Jesus ask? At the end of Luke chapter 2, Mary and Joseph lose track of Jesus when he's a young boy, and they freak out. They search for him everywhere. 3 days go by, the terror for these parents, before they finally find him. And when they do, they're both frustrated and overcome with relief that they finally found their boy. And exasperated Mary asks her son, "Why have you done this to us?" And the first words of Jesus recorded in the Gospels are not with an answer or even with a question. The first words of Jesus recorded in the Gospels are 2 questions. Why were you searching for me? And didn't you know that I had to be in my Father's house? The text says that they found him, that when they found him, he was in the temple courts, sitting with the most elite religious leaders in the country, and they were amazed by his understanding as he asked them questions. The last words of Jesus before his death, the Gospel of Matthew and Mark tell us that his last words were also a question. My God, why have you forsaken me? The words of Jesus after the resurrection, the Gospels include that even the risen Christ, when he returns to earth, he keeps asking really spiritually significant questions like, do you have anything to eat? But think of the other questions that Jesus asked. Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to your life? Why do you call me good? Why are you so afraid? What do you want me to do for you? How many loaves do you have? If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? What shall we say the kingdom of God is like? Or what parable shall we use to describe it? Do you want to get well? What are you looking for? Do you love me? What about you? Who do you say that I am? Many of these are fantastic evangelistic questions. There are approximately 980 direct questions asked in the New Testament. 15% of all the questions, or of all the sentences in the Greek New Testament, are questions. Almost 1/10 of the recorded activity of Jesus is spent in conversation, prompted by questions. Do you know how many questions Jesus asked as recorded in the Gospels? Over 300. Do you know how many questions Jesus was asked? Over 180. And do you know how many questions Jesus directly answered? only 5. Jesus was almost 40 times more likely to ask a question than he was to give a direct answer. It's amazing to me that Jesus, in all of his divinity, would choose to ask questions. If there was anybody who had the right to use only answers and never ask a single question, it was Christ himself. In fact, the use of Jesus's questions demonstrates his deep humanity. Jesus asking humble questions, asking others for help, like the woman at the well, can I have something to drink? And yet, it was one of his primary tools of transformation. Yes, Jesus was and remains today the way, the truth, and the life. All of his life and teachings are worth following in every single area of our lives. And Jesus most certainly did teaching. But what continues to startle me is how little Jesus focused on answers and how much he focused on asking questions. Jesus knew that the right questions were often what brought about the most influence in people's lives, sometimes even more than the right answer. You see, statements can provide information, but they are not usually emotionally persuasive. Questions can combine information and emotion, which is far more persuasive. Jesus knew that questions were one of the most powerful tools available to him to help people reach awareness of themselves, of his Father, and of him, and thus would pave the way for transformation. Like a scalpel, like a surgeon using a scalpel to make an incision on a patient in an operating room in order to provide healing, Jesus uses questions like a scalpel on people's hearts. The great questions are personal, so personal, in fact, that they draw blood. Wouldn't you agree? Sometimes they drew blood from the Pharisees and the religious leaders of the day. And sometimes they drew blood because, like a surgeon, the knife was ultimately to set right what was sick in order to bring about healing. As questions scholar Douglas Estes said, you cannot learn without questions. You cannot have character formation without questions. So let me pose this question to you. Can we have fruitful gospel conversations without questions as well? The road to the with God life is paved with questions. If this is the case, then we better pay attention to the power of questions, and we better pay attention to the questions of Jesus and how he asked them. It's been said that Jesus is the answer to all of our questions, and I would agree. But would it not also be true that Jesus is also the question to all of our answers? It was the French philosopher Voltaire who said, judge a man not by his answers, but by his questions. And by that, then, Jesus is absolutely brilliant. Questions not only give us new ways of thinking, they offer a challenge for us to rethink and to let go of other inaccurate, unhelpful, and even dangerous ways of thinking. They actually help us to unlearn as much as to learn and to relearn. It could be said that Jesus's leadership came through questionable influence. What if we engaged in questionable evangelism? Jesus's impact and teachable moments were seized largely because of asking the right questions at the right time to the right people for the right reason. Yet he spoke and taught and preached. Of course he did. But it was his questions that were often the most gripping, engaging, and life-altering elements of his ministry. Now, I want us to think about our own lives here. Most of us have been raised believing evangelism is about answering the questions. And certainly, that is part of it. But could it be said that the Christian story is actually about learning to wonder, to learn, to explore by asking the right questions? If part of the reason Jesus asked questions was to help people unlearn in order to relearn, then what implications does that have in how we think about our approach to evangelism and spiritual formation? Jesus says, unless we become like little children, we'll not enter the kingdom of heaven. Aren't children the ones who ask the best, most innocent, most curious, most wondrous, and most incessant questions? Could it be said that when Jesus says that we're to be like little children, he might be inferring that we learn to ask questions like them too? The quality and the depth of our questions will directly influence the quality and depth of our soul. And the quality and the depth of the questions we ask others will have a direct influence on the fruitfulness of gospel conversations for the sake of their souls as well. Could it be that your questions, not your answers, may be the most fruitful aspect of your evangelism in the new reality? Many followers of Jesus from around the world, they study Jesus' miracles. They study his parables. They study his teachings. They study his interactions with the disciples. Why don't we study his questions? So if Jesus asked so many incisive questions, why don't we? Jesus, the source of all of our hope and faith, who chose not to embrace the title of divine answer giver, instead he embraced the posture of lead question asker. And he knew the power and the potential of questions in people's formation and their journey to the Father. And so, if we believe like Jesus that questions are the most powerful and significant tools for spiritual formation in our lives and in the lives of those around us,